If I were to tell you in 2019 that Israel Adesanya is the cringiest champion in UFC history, you would have laughed in my face and called me a jealous hater. But 10 painted fingernails and a couple dog diddles later, all of a sudden everything's reversed. Izzy fans are harder to find than fucking Bilal fans, and if you are able to find that lone comment in support of Izzy, it's gonna come with a string of active haters ready to remind that guy why he's a bestiality supporting casual. It is the largest shift in public opinion since Jon Jones successfully defended the belt for the 12th time against his wife. And with some of the other channels being too afraid of losing their gambling sponsors to really get into the trenches of this shit show, I will happily go through every dirty detail in this fantastic downfall, monetized or not. So without further ado, this is the story of Israel Adesanya. It all starts in the wake of the most profitable 2 months in the history of the UFC. Conor McGregor became the first two-division champion ever, and Amanda Nunes ruined any future hope for women selling pay-per-views. It was a glorious time to be an MMA fan, but much like everything in life, what goes up must come down, and for the next 2 years, pay-per-view sales were fucking abysmal. The fights themselves were fantastic, of course, but without anybody but Conor properly promoting themselves, the UFC pretty much became reliant on Conor, which is very unfortunate for them because Conor basically decided to stop fighting after the Mayweather saga.
How the f did they let me roll up in here?
It seemed as though the UFC was running out of options. Anderson Silva and Brock Lesnar were a distant memory. Ronda Rousey was tired of getting beat the f up, and the most exciting active champion was Tyron Woodley. But unbeknownst to UFC fans, there was major trouble brewing deep in the heart of Beijing, where Israel Adesanya was cementing himself as one of the greatest Chinese kickboxers of all time. Izzy managed a bedazzling 75-5 kickboxing record while simultaneously going 9-0 in mixed martial arts, including a win over Song Kenan. And I know Song Kenan isn't considered top tier by any means, but when Izzy fought him, Izzy was 3-0 in MMA. Kenan was 8-1 with 6 submissions. Obviously, there was a decent size discrepancy with Song fighting 17 pounds over his preferred weight class, but a track record like that is fucking nightmarish for a kickboxer with little cage time. And yet Izzy kept defying the odds, winning all of his MMA bouts. It got to the point where he was completing so many side quests that Dana had to force him to fight in the UFC before he became too overpowered. But Dana's efforts proved to be futile, as Izzy's pre-main quest grinding made everyone except Marvin Vettori look like a fucking PFL reject. Naysayers who thought Izzy would get fraud checked as soon as he fought a wrestler were silenced when Derek Brunson himself got fraud checked by an Izzy whose takedown defense was apparently just fine. Anderson Silva passed down the torch by force as he got absolutely outclassed by what seemed like a better, younger version of himself. And Kelvin Gastelum got out-Mexican by an Izzy who's apparently got earth-shattering power in a dogfight. All the ingredients were coming together for an Anderson Silva-esque come-up. The only issue, which is hilariously the same issue Anderson always had, was Izzy's complete inability to do anything interesting outside the octagon. Inside the octagon, it's like watching the fucking Goku Matrix. But outside the octagon, the only thing interesting he's ever brought to the table is his interest in anime, and even that shit got weird. I mean, for fuck's sake, he was the Naruto kid turned real-life ninja that everyone who likes weird stuff could relate to, and he couldn't even maintain that audience. Honestly, if he just shut his fucking mouth and didn't let any of his personality drip on the microphone or anywhere else for that matter, he would forever be known as the real-life anime fighter. That's what fucks me up the most about what we're gonna get into in a minute. It's the possibility that Izzy could have pled the fifth for his entire UFC career, and people would have just found a reason to like him. He didn't need to be this fucking awkward Conor McGregor from Alice in Wonderland creature. He could have just let the fights speak for themselves, and all of us would have adored him the same way we adore Anderson. But instead, we got moments like this.
He's improved, but he's always been a beast. But I'm a different beast with the same animal.
And this.
Trust me, he knows I put him on skates last time. And this time when I put you on skates, I'm gonna leave you frozen like Elsa.
The cringe fest got so bad so quick that Izzy's skills and his belt just didn't make up for it anymore. Even his fans started acting like concerned parents who didn't understand why their autistic kid somehow aces all of his tests, but acts like a complete degenerate at the same time. It was a crazy game of mental gymnastics that we were all forced to go through because the fucker just wouldn't lose. No matter how terribly awful he was on the mic, and no matter how much everyone hated his behavior, he would not lose. And to make matters worse, he would talk up each performance like it was going to be the fight of the century. But the only fight that ended up being half as exciting as advertised just so happened to not have a crowd to watch it. All 4 of his other defenses, including his shot at the light heavyweight title, were fucking snooze fest. Marvin Vettori single-handedly created the most entertaining press conference of 2021, but the highlight of that fight was a fucking booty slap. Robert Whittaker, bless his heart, tried to fight the judges, and we all knew how that shit was gonna go. And Jared Cannonier is Jared Cannonier. However, it was within the build-up to Izzy's 5th title defense that, for the first time in Izzy's professional career, there was finally an individual both willing and literate enough to verbally tear him into fucking pieces. And that individual was Sean Strickland. Now, I don't know whose idea it was for Izzy to come to the press conference dressed like Stevie Wonder's cracked out uncle, but he looked like a fucking disgusting mess. And Sean just sat there effortlessly clowning Izzy for what I imagine was the longest 3 minutes of Izzy's life. You could literally hear the difference in crowd support for Izzy before the grilling versus after the grilling.
I don't really care, to be honest. I'm just trying to do what I said, which is fuck everybody up in this game, and he's next. Trust me, he knows I put him on skates last time. And this time, when I put you on skates, I'm gonna leave you frozen like Elsa.
I don't think there is a single time in UFC history that a crowd went from enthusiastically supporting a champion to awkwardly sitting there wondering why they came to begin with. Sean actually convinced an entire audience of people that their opinion was wrong and they had no choice but to just accept it. Usually it would be considered disrespectful to talk trash to someone who's not your opponent, especially during a press conference.
I called him baby
what's
girl
the
and he got
question?
mad.
Guys, come on, these two aren't even fighting. Knock it off.
But with the obvious language barrier preventing any entertainment coming back from Alex Pereira, the immediate Terminator target switch to Izzy made perfect sense. Not only is he obviously the champion, but he was wearing 4 or 5 insults on his body. For a guy like Strickland, who, let's face it, specializes in crowd work, this shit was like if a juicy salmon threw itself on a plate with a fork and knife and then seasoned itself for the grizzly bear to enjoy with his glass of fucking lake water. It became very clear that if Izzy and Sean were to win their fights, Izzy's next title defense would undoubtedly be the grudge match of our dreams. But Sean got slept and Izzy dominated Jared comfortably, which was once again the worst possible outcome for the fans. Guaranteed another year minimum of having to deal with this fucking gender-confused sociopath. And it also seemingly guaranteed Dana was gonna file a restraining order against Sean Strickland on behalf of the middleweight belt. The only hope UFC fans had was in the hands of Alex Pereira, who at that time was the only guy in the middleweight division with a chance to beat Izzy on paper. He already got it done twice in kickboxing, and from the looks of pretty much all of his MMA fights, he was more than capable of handling himself if Izzy decided to grapple. All signs pointed to the hardest fight of Izzy's life, if not the complete destruction of his legacy. And what ended up happening was the latter. History repeated itself for a 3rd time with a 5th round comeback TKO for Alex Pereira, forever ruining Izzy's chances of becoming the greatest middleweight of all time. No longer would Izzy fans have his unstoppable title run to excuse his abhorrent personality. No longer would Izzy's fucking titty muffin be powerful enough to sustain him at the highest levels. And no longer would we have to deal with the fucking cringe fest. Or at least that's what I thought at the time. But like it or not, Izzy's been an absolute cash cow with fans who don't watch YouTube exposés. Therefore, Dana wasn't gonna give this one up without a tussle. The rematch was booked in less than 2 months, giving Izzy a grand total of 5 months to recover from the TKO. Certainly not ideal circumstances for a rematch after a loss like that. But Izzy's always been a bad motherfucker when it comes to nutting up for fights, so no one was surprised to see the announcement so soon. What did surprise everyone was the accessory Izzy chose to wear for the Adesanya Pereira 2 press conference. Now, I personally didn't notice the dog collar until the press mentioned it because I was so focused on Gilbert's fucking bootleg Mario outfit, but Jesus Christ, man. Even without knowing about the dog stuff, that is incredibly weird. I mean, I get the dog being unleashed theme, but if he came to the presser in a policeman's uniform with handcuffs and said, "I'm an officer of the law and Alex is under arrest," it still would have been weird. However, the folks in Miami were not put off by it whatsoever, and the media didn't pick up on it at all past the one question that was asked on stage. So the topic just kind of died at the press conference. Fast forward 24 hours and everyone's hope of that not happening again died too. Izzy knocked out Pereira so fucking violently that while Alex was in the shadow realm, he actually talked to his ancient ancestors, and they all told him to move up to light heavyweight. So within the horror of Alex dropping like wet cement, there was still promise in his career overall. But for the rest of us, we just kind of thought we were stuck. Prime Izzy had returned with a vengeance, and his wonder tit powers seemed to be greater than ever before. We all thought we'd finally come to the end of the horror movie, but instead we had just reached the climax. And looking down at the the rest of the division did not bring any hope for change. Dricus du Plessis didn't even exist yet. Sean Strickland got beat by Jared Cannonier, and let's be honest, with Jared's added win over Marvin Vettori, it was just hard to justify Sean over him. Robert Whittaker already got beat twice, and nobody wanted to see it happen the second time. And what does that leave? Brendan Allen? I mean, we were really getting to a point where Izzy looked like he could lap the top 5 for the third time. There was even mass discussion as to why the UFC would even book Whittaker versus du Plessis. Robert had so widely distinguished himself from all the other contenders that the du Plessis matchup just seemed like an unnecessary task, as well as a complete mismatch. Not to mention the fact that du Plessis and Adesanya had the #1 ingredient for pay-per-view stew, which is racial tension. It made way more sense to feed Dricus to Izzy before Rob killed a potentially massive pay-per-view, but I guess Dana just didn't feel like Dricus was known by enough of the fan base to put him under the bright lights. Either way, Izzy and Dricus' cute little back and forth about who's the African and who's the cracker was seemingly swept under the rug, only to be settled after a fight that the entire planet thought Dricus had no chance of winning. And with Izzy strategically placing himself on a card 2 months away from UFC 290, the deck was stacked even more heavily against Dricus. A win would simply mean having to turn around in 2 months for the hardest fight of his life after just having the hardest fight of his life. But a loss would likely mean another 7 mandatory wins before he's back in title conversation. Either way, the #1 contenders match was set, and there wasn't anything we could do to change that. In the meantime, ranked middleweight matchups were going down in dramatic fashion left and right. Jared Cannonier beat the absolute piss out of Marvin Vettori, and Sean Strickland disposed of a seriously good prospect with one pregnant eye. Dricus' stakes were getting higher and higher with each passing week. He knew that if anything went wrong, even in victory, it would still be on him to make his fastest turnaround since 2013. What he didn't know was that the only thing he brought to the table besides disproportionately large shoulders was the racial tension that he didn't even intend to create. Dricus wanted ethnic tension. Izzy just decided to do him a favor by making it racial because his blackness allowed it. But without that factor involved in the build-up, there was nothing there other than a fucking South African Robert Whittaker. Honestly, I think the only reason Whittaker versus du Plessis got scheduled in the first place was to try to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Robert's always been a little chinny, and du Plessis specializes in comeback victories, so no matter what happened, the likelihood was that whoever won would not be in fighting in 2 months condition. However, what ended up happening seemed to be better than the best case scenario. Du Plessis TKO'd Robert Whittaker in 2 rounds, absorbing a grand total of 31 strikes. And to cap it all off, Izzy did Dricus another massive solid by making a complete ass of himself during Dricus' post-fight interview.
What's up? Let's go. Yeah, what's up? Get this don't do. Yeah, my African brother. Yeah, my African brother.
Izzy's presence was supposed to be this intense WWE stare-down moment, but instead he decided to flex his apex Africanness by calling Dricus the word white Europeans used to call the slaves they bought from Izzy's great-great-grandparents. And he said it knowing the whole world would pressure Dana to cancel Dricus if he dares say anything back. It might have been the single most racist thing I've seen on live television since the Something Wong incident. And Dana didn't make it any better in the post-fight interview when he confirmed his support for Izzy's racism.
And kind of the racial undertones and all those things. How do you...
What were the racial undertones?
Dricus says he's the real African fighter, and so, you know, Israel dropped some N-words in there tonight.
So what was the racial?
So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the perfect 30-second demonstration of gaslighting. Keep in mind that the first page of the Fighter Code of Conduct states that derogatory or offensive conduct, including without limitation, insulting language, symbols, or actions about a person's ethnic background, heritage, color, race, national origin, age, religion, disability, gender, or sexual orientation. All of these offenses are considered punishable misconduct. Even though Dana says the fighters can say what they want, this is what the fighters have to sign before they join the organization. They are not supposed to be allowed to be openly racist towards their opponent. Now, with this context in mind, let's watch this fantastic clip.
And kind of the racial undertones and all those things. How do you...
What were the racial undertones?
So Dana was so taken aback that he interrupts the question to ask what racial undertones. Like he has no idea what Big John was talking about. He also asks it as if he would be concerned if there were racial undertones. Either way, Dana apparently had money in his ear when Izzy was dropping N-bombs, but we'll continue.
What were the racial undertones?
Dricus says he's the real African fighter, and so, you know, Israel dropped some N-words in there tonight.
So what was the racial?
So now we've gone from being concerned about the possibility of racial undertones to the actuality of racism that Dana can't deny because the evidence has been presented to him by Big John. And instead of just calling it what it is, Dana has now gone full retard and just pretends he doesn't know what the word means. And keep in mind, Izzy has zero ties to America. He's not a slave descendant black guy who's using urban slang because it's his culture. He's just copping a word that's considered extremely racist if anybody but a non-slave descendant black person uses it. So for Dana to sit there with the face he probably gives his wife when he's been out too late and pretend he has no fucking clue how someone would come to the conclusion that Izzy was being a little bit racist is just classic Dana.
So what was the racial? Who did? Who dropped the racial?
Israel was saying over and over, yeah. Dropped
He's black.
50 N-bombs in
Okay,
there.
he's black.
Okay, so now we've gone from concerned there might be racial undertones to pretending to not know what the N-word means to not only knowing what the N-word means, but also knowing the unspoken rule that doesn't even actually exist that states that only black people can use it. As in, if a white person were to use it, that would be considered racial undertones. Dana basically stated that black people are allowed to be racist and not white people. I guarantee you if Drickus called him the N-word back, he would have been suspended if not cut from the sport.
Who gives a shit?
I was gonna say, so you don't have any concern about the way the build-up, the tension between those two?
I could care less. This is the fight business. Israel Adesanya can say whatever he wants to say. Who gives a shit?
Okay, Dana, if who gives a shit is the answer, then why do you have a code of conduct? Because you certainly didn't have a who gives a shit attitude when Alex Nicholson made a singular remark about Asians that was apparently so despicable that the UFC had to put out a public statement to address the situation. Reading as follows. UFC competitor Alex Nicholson made a derogatory comment toward another UFC athlete while cornering his teammate Mike Perry at UFC 202. UFC has addressed this matter with Nicholson as well as Perry to express the organization's disappointment with Nicholson's insensitive remark. As such, the organization informed Nicholson that any future instances of this nature could result in a suspension from competition or termination from his contract. So basically, the UFC picks and chooses who gets to be racist. They have that code of conduct ready to whip out anytime someone they don't like says the wrong thing, but when it comes to their cash cow, all of a sudden black people get to be racist. There's no fucking clause in that code of conduct that says does not apply to black people. And like I said, I'm not trying to cancel Izzy for what he said. I actually think being a fucking racist asshole was the coolest thing he could have done for Drickus' bank account. But if we're gonna let black fighters say what they want, we need to keep that same energy for everyone. Regardless, the entire race baiting situation may not have pissed off Dana, but it certainly pissed off a good chunk of UFC fans. And it went without saying that on that day, Du Plessis versus Adesanya was the fight we all needed to see.
Ariel Wani tweeted out, "It's not quite official, but pretty close at this point that Drickus Du Plessis will not be able to fight Israel Adesanya at UFC 293 on September 9th in Sydney. He was banged up going into the Robert Whittaker fight. That turnaround is just too soon, I'm told. If that ends up being the case and Israel Adesanya stays on the card, which is his desire, it'll be Adesanya versus Sean Strickland for the middleweight title on 9/9. So tell me what you guys think about all of that in the comments below.
Look, as a Sean Strickland fan, this announcement made me giddy as a fucking schoolgirl. But this was painfully unfair to Drickus. The man had to sit there and get racial slurs screamed at him like he is fucking Jackie Robinson. Couldn't say a damn thing back because he knows how it would make him look. Then had to give up his one and only title shot to the number 5. The fans fortunately still got a beef match because the wounds from 276 were still fresh, but everyone knows the War of Africa was what people really wanted. Sean Strickland, on the other hand, got the opportunity of his fucking life, and I guarantee there's not an injury beyond amputation that would have stopped him from taking this fight. However, opportunity alone was not going to win Sean the strap. In fact, pretty much everyone in MMA thought this matchup was laughable at best. Izzy's haters were already preparing for a fat L, while also being hopeful for another epic Sean Strickland press conference. But nobody really knew what was in store in the coming weeks. Most probably assumed Izzy would come dressed as a fucking Chinese dragon or some shit, with Sean just flaming the piss out of him. But only one man truly knew what was going to happen at that faithful press conference. One man who had so many bombshells ready to drop it would have made fucking Henry Kissinger Papa Hemorrhoid. And that man is the MMA guru, the incel mob boss of YouTube. Guru's been an active Izzy hater since before most of his comment section was born. And because of his previously established connection with Sean Strickland, Guru decided that he needed to do more digging on Izzy than ever before. Anything he found could potentially be used by Sean Strickland at the press conference, so Guru dug like he has never dug before, and just 5 days before the fight was on, Guru carpet bombed YouTube with 3 massive exposés. First of all, Izzy's cringy steroid denials were laid out in abundance. Secondly, Izzy's childhood was revealed to be full of nothing but privilege and servants, which is just a patronizing word for slaves. And thirdly, it was revealed that Izzy had apparently molested his fucking dog on camera for some random Twitter video. Now, admittedly, the video wasn't as shocking as Guru made it out to be. I mean, I thought I was about to watch Izzy butt fuck his poor little dog, but it's more like a wink wink nudge nudge, this is what I do with my dog in my spare time. It really felt like the one guy everyone knows who makes pedophile jokes way too often, to the point that you actually start thinking about putting an anonymous tip in with the authorities to check his fucking basement. That's how I felt after watching it. The only person who apparently didn't feel some type of way about it was Dana. And this is the part of the story that I haven't heard anybody talk about. So earlier when I went over the UFC's code of conduct, I was referencing non-criminal behavior, which according to the fine print is technically open to the UFC's interpretation. However, the words are very clear when it comes to criminal behavior. It states that while criminal activity by a UFC fighter is clearly detrimental to the reputation of the UFC and therefore subjects the fighter to discipline, other conduct can also result in disciplinary action. Now you might ask yourself, does the fighter have to actually be a criminal to qualify for disciplinary actions? And the answer to that is no. You see, back in 2020, Mike Perry was charged with Class A assault and a misdemeanor for allegedly getting into a brawl with 3 individuals at a Texas bar. It looked really bad and a lot of it was on video, so there wasn't really anything Mike could deny. However, nothing came of the charges. And until the state of Texas decides otherwise, Mike Perry didn't do a goddamn thing that night. But it didn't stop the UFC from immediately coming out with this statement. The UFC is aware and troubled by the video that was released last night concerning Mike Perry. The conduct displayed by Perry is not reflective of that of our organization. Perry apologized for his behavior and acknowledged that he was disappointed with himself and that his actions may have reflected poorly on the UFC. He further acknowledged that he believes he has some issues related to alcohol abuse and has informed the UFC that he is committed to immediately seeking professional treatment, including substance and behavior counseling. At this time, UFC has informed Perry that he will not be offered a bout, and the parties have agreed to evaluate the next step for Perry following the completion of his treatment program. This statement was put out a day after the alleged bar incident. Now, honestly, looking at the video, it seems like Perry was throwing a temper tantrum for sure, but this random, stupid, fat old man was literally taunting Mike Perry as he was freaking out. The old man then charges at Mike, who promptly knocks him the f out, and then Mike says the N-word a whole bunch of times. Nowhere in that video does there appear to be a serious crime committed. If anything, the old man should have been charged with assault for trying to tackle a UFC fighter. Now compare that situation to the doggy off debacle. Most people look at it like it's just another branch of Izzy's terrible personality, but the fact of the matter is Izzy doesn't live in Kentucky. Izzy lives in a place where jerking your dog off on camera is supposed to come with up to 3 years in prison. The fact that he was willing to put a video out of himself doing that should have been more than enough evidence for the UFC to take quote-unquote disciplinary actions. Mike Perry had to go to fucking Alcoholics Anonymous because he threw a fit at some random bar. Izzy recorded himself sexually violating his dog completely sober, and it's crickets from the entire media. Not even Mojahed controlled opposition feudalette dared put his hands on the subject. The only videos about this on the internet, to my knowledge, are the MMA gurus. The UFC has an excuse not to touch this issue. Can you imagine being Dana White having to sit there and explain to the world how you let a dog diddler get his hands on the middleweight title? With your self-proclaimed contract of morality, get the f out of here. You'd have no choice but to stumble over your words like a retard, no matter how slick you are. So with all that being said, I say the UFC should either discipline Adesanya for his crimes against dogmanity, the same way he damn near ruined the career of Mike Perry, or just do what Dana claims they're all about, which is let the fighters do what the f they want. But the sad reality is the UFC is the same as any corrupt company, politician, or government. So watching Sean Strickland stand up on that stage, confidently call out the UFC's ultimate degenerate champion for off his dog in front of millions of people, it felt pretty gratifying. And the best part about it is the UFC will always have to wear that press conference as a badge of stupidity on their channel, forever bookmarking September 7th, 2023 as the day of Izzy's career death. The rest of the story is recent history. Sean Strickland defied all odds and beat Izzy like a bad dog for 25 minutes straight. Possibly the most one-sided upset in the history of middleweight title fights. But the upset itself wasn't what amazed me the most. What really got me as a card-carrying Izzy hater was Dana's complete flip-flop answer about an immediate rematch. On the afternoon of UFC 293, Dana spent half the post-fight interview making excuses for Izzy's performance, which I assume was because of the potential pay-per-view sales for the rematch. But I guess whoever's in charge of analytics at the UFC did another fan scan that night and found out how unpopular Izzy had become on social media after the dog incident, because Dana acted like he didn't know who the Izzy was in the Contender Series press conference 3 days later. This is a guy who the UFC has catered to in every conceivable way for almost half a decade. Forgotten about at the drop of a fucking hat. All those awful lines, all that taking advantage of his skin color, all that dog diddling. Now Izzy can have all the quadrilogies he wants in peace and quiet, right where he belongs.